Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of Joshua chapter 5. We're going to learn the second half. Today we are going to discuss the celebration of Passover, of Pesach, which also will be the first Pesach, the first Passover the people celebrate in the new land prior to the beginning of the combat, before the actual conquering begins. So before the war begins, the people were settled now on the western side of the Jordan, within the land of Israel, and we're about to celebrate Passover. But before that, we are going to read an extremely interesting verse. So we're going to start with chapter 5, verse 9. Vayomer Adonai el Yehoshua. God said to Joshua as follows, Hayom, today. And this is referring, today we just completed the circumcision that we just talked about. Galo, see, I have uncovered, I have revealed et cherpat Mitzrayim, the shame of Egypt, me'alechem, from upon the people. Vayikra shem hamakom hahu Gilgal ad hayom hazeh. And he called this place Gilgal. Gilgal, presumably Gil from Melamed from the word Galosi, I have revealed. And God doubled it, revealed. Gilgal is a double reveal, like very much revealed the Cherpat Mitzrayim. Now, for those of you that listened, and I highly recommend that you listen to my previous podcast, 5a, the people had just been asked to circumcise themselves, and by circumcising themselves, they removed the Cherpat Mitzrayim, the shame of Egypt. What does this mean, remove the shame of Egypt? I know if you look in the commentaries, there's a lot of different explanations, and each one has its importance and its value. But I'm going to continue with a theme that I started the last one. That is that circumcision represents humility, recognizing that it is not the human masculine strength of power and might, which is represented by the male phallus. However, it is our special relationship with God that gives us our inner strength and moral and ethical guidance. Now, this is represented by the circumcision, by removing the foreskin, and which is, again, why, and I know I said this a bunch yesterday, that it was Arlat Levavchem. It was the Milah throughout the Torah, throughout the Bible, constantly refers to removing arrogance, Arlat Halev. Now, so what does it mean when God says here, I revealed the Cherpat Mitzrayim, the shame of Egypt? In order to explain this, I want to refer back to Ezekiel 31. Ezekiel 31, that's Yechezkel chapter Lamed Aleph, Parak 31, where God prophesizes through through Ezekiel, and he talks a little bit about an event in history that is going to happen later. However, it relates very much to Egypt, and it's very, very, very closely related to what we're studying today, and I think it's important for us to understand it. And God says to Ezekiel, this is occurring in during the time at the end of the First Temple period, many hundreds of years after the events we're reading about now in Joshua. It was a time when the nation of Assyria had already succumbed and been destroyed by the nation of Babylon, and Babylon was the big shot at the time, and Babylon's primary enemy, major enemy, was Egypt at the time, was the only large empire that challenged Babylon at this juncture in history during Ezekiel's time. This was before the Persian Empire became great and eventually conquered the Babylonian Empire, which was only like one or two generations after Ezekiel. But here it goes. Ezekiel turns his attention towards Egypt, and I want you to remember this is Egypt, and he says, Amor Paro, this is verse 2, God says to Ezekiel, I want you to transmit this message to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, El Hamono, and to his this is often translated, his hordes, his masses of people. El mida misa bigolecha. Who can you compare yourself to? God wants Ezekiel to turn towards Egypt and give them a lesson in history. Who's similar to you? You guys are big and strong and mighty and thousands of people, and you have all these weapons and everything, and you're great and so on. But who's like you? Sure, look at Assyria. They were great like you. And then God goes on to describe how great and mighty the Assyrian Empire was. I'm not going to go read through it, but they had wealth, that they had power. Let's read through verse 3, 4, 5. And therefore, what did they do? In verse 5, Ezekiel 31, Gavha komaso, they became arrogant. Their height, their greatness was higher than all the other trees of the field. They became arrogant, right? What happened? Asher gavata b'komo, God says, this is verse 10, because you became so arrogant and so high, v'rom livavo b'gavho, and you became arrogant, your heart became too stuck up with yourselves and your own greatness because you were so great. Therefore, I put Assyria into the hands of their enemies, and they were chopped down, and their greatness collapsed into everything. And therefore, and then God goes ahead and describes the destruction of Assyria because of their arrogance. But then God says in verse 18, El Mida Misa, God reminds the people of Egypt, who are you similar to now that you guys are sitting at the top of the world and everything? Hu Pharaoh v'chol hamona. You are like, that's you, that's Pharaoh. But what is the language that God uses? Look at Ezekiel 31:18, and this is what I was driving towards the whole time. El mida misa kacha b'chavod v'godel. To whom can you compare yourselves in greatness and in stature? Ba'atse Eden, among the trees of Eden. In other words, among the trees of my garden, who's the biggest and tallest? Who can you compare yourselves to? Assyria. And you will be brought down, just like those other great trees, Eretz Tachtis. And listen to this language: Betoch arelim, you are going to be destroyed among those uncircumcised. Tishkavet chalei cherev, you are going to lie there with all of the corpses of those armies that have been slaughtered. Hu Pharaoh v'chol amona, that will be the ultimate end of Pharaoh and your hordes if you do not learn this lesson and come down from your arrogance. Look what the language that God uses when he refers to Egypt and its haughtiness. This helps us understand what Cherpat Mitzrayim is over here. What is Joshua talking about? Yes, I know that I shot forward about hundreds of years in history, but the point here is that the arrogance of Egypt is the arrogance of an Orel, of an uncircumcised, one who does not circumcise himself, one who does not circumcise his heart, does not circumcise his male masculine might. That's Cherpat Mitzrayim, and God is saying over here, I have now revealed it. How have I revealed it? By commanding you to circumcise yourselves, to remind yourselves where your true power and strength comes from. And now that you recognize that, now you are ready to celebrate that relationship that began at the Exodus of Egypt. Vayachnu b'nei Yisrael b'Gilgal, and the people of Israel then camped. Now I'm back to Joshua, verse 10. The people of Israel camped in Gilgal, in the place of the reveal, where they revealed their hearts to be tied to God, Vayasu es HaPesach, and now they can celebrate the Pesach, the Passover, the Arba Ashar on the 14th day, Yom Lachodesh Ba'erev of the month, the 14th day of the first month of the year, Ba'erev in the evening, Ba'arvos Yericho in the Arvot, in the steppes, in the plains of Jericho, because they're about to embark on the capture of the city of Jericho. Vayochlu me'avor ha'aretz, and they ate from the produce of the land, Mimacharat HaPesach, on the day after the Passover, matzot v'kalui, they ate matzot. Remember, matzot is unleavened bread, which is eaten on the Passover, and kalui is parched grain, in other words, fried without becoming leavened, be'etzam hayom hazeh, during this day. And remember that it's only after this day that they're able to eat of the fruit of the land. Vayishpos Haman, and this was also the day when the manna, the man, stopped falling. Mimacharat, on that next day, biachlam me'avor arts. Now that they're able to eat of the fruit of the land, v'lohaya od livnei Yisrael man, and no longer did the people of Israel have the man. Vayachlu mituat eretz Canaan b'shanayeh, and that year they lived and sustained themselves by eating from the produce that was available in the land of Canaan, of Canaan. So this is a crucial event, and we fully can understand and appreciate the relationship between circumcision and Passover. Anyone familiar with the Passover Haggadah, the service that we read on Passover night at the Seder, the relationship of B'damai Chayi, the two bloods, the blood of the Paschal Lamb and the blood of the circumcision, and the relationship between the two, here in Joshua 5 is where we see that relationship so closely. And we're about to read now about a very interesting episode. Vayehi b'hiyos Yoshua b'Yericho. Now, after all of this happened, the lesson of the circumcision and the lesson of the celebration of Passover, and now the people, by more and more we find and we get this feeling that God is receding into the background. The miracles are becoming less miraculous, so to speak. Now the manna is gone. The people are starting to eat regular fruit of the land. And now an interesting event occurs. It happened when Joshua was in Yericho. So presumably this occurred at during the time of right after the celebration of Passover, which we just read about. Yoshua raised up his eyes, vayar, and he saw a vision. Ish omed lenegdo. There was a man standing opposite him. And this man had a withdrawn sword in his hand. Now we find this term ish, and as we're going to see as we read through it, that this was a angel, a representation of an angel of God that Joshua was seeing. And we find many times, we just referenced Ezekiel before. Ezekiel certainly saw an ish, and then we find it in Daniel, an ish, which is a reference to an angel coming in the appearance of a man. We find it, of course, with Abraham. Many times throughout the Torah, we find a angel represented in an image to a prophet when he appears to a prophet as the image of a man. So, and he was standing there with charbosh lufa biyado, with a sword withdrawn in his hand. This also reminds us of the image that Bilam, that the donkey saw an angel with a sword withdrawn. So Yoshua sees this image, and he says to him, Halonu ata im litzarenu. Are you with us, or are you here to punish us? There is a lot of many commentaries and many approaches to this. I tend to think of this as a Yoshua probably understood immediately that this was the image of an angel. But Yoshua did not know, is this an angel similar to the angel that Bilam encountered who had a sword, who was about to slaughter Bilam, in other words, because he had done something wrong? Or is this an angel that represents the sword which we are about to use against the people of Canaan, and then you're coming here to send me a message that we are going to be victorious? In other words, are you here to bring me bad news or good news? A sword, depending on who you're wielding it against, me or my enemies, as Joshua said, Halonu, are you with us? Or are you with our enemies? A sword could be either good news or bad news. Vayomer, lo, no. Ki ani sar tzva Adonai. I am the chief of God's army, right? Atovasi, and I have come now. What is this answer? We find many, again, there's a lot of commentaries, but I would like to just let's make this simple. Ata, now that you people have represented, you have done the circumcision, and you have taken away your arrogance, you have humbled yourselves before God and cemented that relationship with God. And now that you have celebrated the Passover, which is a celebration of the special relationship that you have with God, now I'm here. And this is extremely interesting because he doesn't say whether or not the sword is going to be used for good or for bad. He doesn't answer his question. And there's a reason why he doesn't answer his question. And the reason is obvious, because that depends. If you continue on the path that you seem to be going on right now, which is the right path, I'm with you. By saying, I am God, the head of God's army, he's reminding Joshua that God's army, what God's army does is dependent on what you do. Are you going to follow my instructions? Are you going to do good, or are you going to do bad? So therefore, Vayipol Yoshua al panav artza vayishtachu, Joshua immediately fell upon his face and he prostrated himself before him. What, my master, do you have to say to his servant? I am a servant of God. I am here to serve God, who you represent. What message do you have for me? And the master, the general of God's army, said to Joshua, take your shoes off your feet. The place which you stand upon, Kodesh, who is holy, Vayas Yoshua Kain, and Joshua did that. This is fascinating because he never answers the question. It's very mysterious, but the point is that he actually did answer the question. Joshua prostrated himself by saying, I am your servant. Joshua is getting the message. That is the message. The message is that if you want me to be with you, you have to humble yourself before me being God, who this angel is representing. Now, according to the way the Jewish chapters are broken, the next verse, which is listed as 6:1, remember I've said this numerous times throughout this podcast, that the current numbering system of chapters and verses were laid out by Christian scholars. For whatever reason, they laid it out this way, and we use it because it standardizes the text across all who read and revere the words of the Bible, Jews and Christians alike. However, the Jewish tradition has this next verse as not being the first verse of the next chapter, but rather being the last verse of this chapter. So I'm going to read it now. Viricho and Jericho, Sogeres u'Misugeres, was closed up tight. They had closed ranks, Mipnei Bnei Yisrael, from before the Jewish people. Ein yotzei ve'ein ba. There was no one coming, no one going. They were readying themselves for the attack. Now, we can certainly understand why one would place that as the first verse of the next chapter, like the Christian numbering system does. It makes a lot of sense, because the episode of the angel seems to have ended, and the episode of Jericho, which we're going to read about in the next chapter, begins. So it would make sense to start that chapter off with Richo. So that is very logical and makes a lot of sense why the Christian numbering system has it that way. But why would the Jewish numbering system have this as the last verse of this encounter? And I want to say that it brings across a really important message. Because when we prostrate ourselves and humble ourselves before God and say, remember Joshua asked the question, God, are you going to help us or are you not going to help us? God's answer is that I will do dependent on what your actions is. If your actions is to make yourself subservient and humble before me, then, excuse me, then I am with you. If not, I am not with you. Now go look at your problems. The Yericho is getting ready, right? The relationship is Yoshua prostrated himself, and then he recognized, now I have a very fundamental human, earthly problem in front of me. We need to attack the city of Jericho because that city is standing in our way. The enemy is there. The enemy is there. I feel it. I know it, right? And God didn't tell me whether or not he's going to conquer the city or not for me. He said he will help me if I humble myself before him. So this relates Joshua's reaction to the problem that stands before him. Like if you imagine if a person is standing before God and with a time of his life when he or she has this tremendous challenge in front of them, and he or she looks to God and she says, God, are you going to help me? Are you going to save me? Are you going to save me? And God doesn't answer. God doesn't say, I will. God doesn't say, I will. God says, I am God. Humble yourself before me. That's God's answer. Now go deal with your problem. Thank you so much for studying chapter 5b together of Joshua. Looking forward to studying chapter 6 and, of course, the entirety of this wonderful book together.